Good morning, y'all. It's always good to be with you for our Bible class time and to be able to spend some time in the book of Genesis. I hope this study is beneficial to you, continues to be so. I hear from folks throughout our congregation from time to time, and I appreciate all the kind remarks I hear about our class. I hope it is something that's been beneficial to you and helpful for you to continue to grow and increase your faith. That's our number one goal in all of this. We're trying to continue to put out material and content to help all of us, even if we aren't together, continue to grow in our relationships with God, and I hope that we're able to do that I hope this Bible class and this medium has been able to help you in that regard. And we're certainly glad that you're with us this morning. Well, as we continue our study of Genesis, we come to chapter 38. And well, y'all, if you don't already know what Genesis chapter 38 is, let me just tell you, it is one of the most bizarre stories in the entire book of Genesis. In fact, it's not really a G-rated story as we read about the story of Judah and Tamar. This is probably one of those stories it's never going to come up. In all the stories we choose to look at in the book of Genesis in our kids' Bible classes, I'm pretty confident Judah and Tamar never showed up in your Bible class when you were in the pre-K class. In fact, it's probably one that most preachers and Bible class teachers try to stay from in general because, well, it makes us squirm in a lot of different ways. It's also interesting in that it seems a bit of an interruption. You know, when we ended last time, chapter 37 ends with, and Joseph was in the house of Potiphar. So you would expect then that chapter 38 is going to just pick up with what happens with Joseph in Potiphar's house. But instead we see this story of Judah and Tamar thrown here into Genesis 38. But I think it's not quite as much of an interruption as it seems. And I think it's important for us to realize that even in the uncomfortableness of it and the nature of the descriptions that we find here, it's important for us to be reminded that one of the beautiful things about the Bible is that it doesn't sugarcoat life. It includes stories in all of the messiness and the discomfort that sometimes life brings. And this story is a reminder of that. But with that, we turn our attention now to the text as we look at this story and going to try to draw a few important reminders for us in our own walks as we walk through it. Well, as Genesis 38 opens, we see that Judah marries a Canaanite woman. This is an interesting thing. We've seen descendants of the patriarchs marry Canaanite women before, right? We saw it in Abraham's fear that Isaac might marry a Canaanite and the great lengths he goes to prevent that. We saw it in the life of Isaac when his son Esau married several Canaanite women. And so it seems here that you can imagine Jacob would have been as displeased by this as his father Isaac had been over Esau's marriages. It certainly seems to us that Moses was making commentary on this. Notice that Judah's wife is not even named. We never even see her name. That in and of itself is an indication of the way that Moses seems to have felt about her. That she wasn't even dignified with a name. Well, nevertheless, Judah marries this Canaanite woman, and they have 3 sons, the oldest of whom was And it tells us here that married Tamar. But was soon killed by God for some unknown sin. The text here doesn't actually tell us what that sin was. And it seems kind of jarring to us at first that he would be done. But it says he was wicked in the sight of the Lord, and the Lord put him to death. Genesis 38 and verse 7. And that in and of itself tells us something significant. This was the first occurrence of this practice happening in Scripture, where God strikes someone dead as punishment for the wickedness that they were engaged in. But nevertheless, that is what happens. Well, under ancient Near Eastern custom, and eventually under the Jewish Levirate law that'll be put in place in the law of Moses, the next oldest son had an obligation to provide an heir for his slain brother by taking his brother's widow. So when does not produce a son with Tamar, he does not have an heir, the task falls to Onan, his younger brother, to produce an heir with Tamar. But the text here tells us that Onan refused to actually impregnate Tamar. He didn't refuse to have sex with her, but he refused to give her an heir, as we see in verses 8 and 9 of Genesis 38 here. And so, this is a rather interesting thing for us. Onan had a lot at stake here, and perhaps that's what's motivating this refusal. The text tells us there that he knew this child would not be his heir, and perhaps he knew even more than that. See, the reality is that he was the second born. The birthright did not belong to him. It belonged to his brother. And if his brother had a son, had an heir, which this child would have been, then Er's birthright would have gone to his heir. What that means in practice then is that, as we've talked about before, the birthright meant that the oldest got a double portion of the inheritance. So Onan would have gone from having inherited 2/3 of Judah's wealth, to only getting 1/4. Because remember, you would have taken the number of children, added a portion, and the oldest would have gotten 2 portions. So there would have then been 4 portions instead of 3, and the oldest would have gotten it. So this child, had Onan fulfilled his obligation, the child would not have been his. It would have been his brother's heir, and would have gotten half the estate and inheritance, while Onan only got 1/4. Whereas if he didn't do that, he would have gotten 2/3 of the inheritance. Perhaps that was why he refused to do so. Furthermore, we see that this was a repeated occurrence. It says that whenever he went in to be with his brother's wife, this tells us that that this wasn't just a one-time refusal, but a continued refusal to fulfill his obligation. Well, verse 10 shows us that God saw this too as wicked in his eyes. Onan's actions were wicked for a number of reasons. One, they dishonored his brother. They dishonored his dead brother by refusing to give him an heir. Second, it failed to fulfill his levirate obligations. The law about heirs and siblings and marriage and widows stated that this was his responsibility. This was his obligation. And he refused to do so. And then third, we also see that he, in essence, chooses to use Tamar as nothing more than an object for his own sexual gratification. He doesn't refuse to have sex with her. He refuses to get her pregnant. He says, yeah, I'll go in there with her, but I ain't going to do what I'm supposed to do. I'm not going to do my part to ensure she has a son. Instead of fulfilling his obligation, he makes her an object of his own sexual gratification to get his own pleasure out of it without actually fulfilling the obligation that he had. For all of these reasons, God kills him too, strikes him down. Well, that means that it would have then fallen to Judah's youngest son to take Tamar and produce an heir. But Judah sent Tamar back to her father's house at this point because Shelah, his youngest son, was not yet old enough to marry. But he sent Tamar back to her father's house and assured her that eventually Shelah would marry her. But Judah never intended to keep this promise. In fact, in the ancient Near Eastern culture, a woman whose husbands kept dying was seen as cursed, perhaps even suspect of witchcraft. In Judah's mind, Tamar was bad news, and he was glad to rid his family of her by sending her back to her father's house. Well, at some point later, perhaps around 20 years later, because remember, a substantial amount of time has passed through all of this. Judah's wife died, his Canaanite wife, and after he had finished his grieving process, he went to Timnah to shear his sheep. Well, knowing that this was coming, Tamar realized that Judah was never going to keep his promise. He realized that Judah by this point had no intention of redeeming her from her widowhood and giving her a child. And so she concocts a plan of her own. She devises to take off her widow's garments and dress herself up like a prostitute and attempt to entice her father-in-law. Now, this plan in and of itself was not completely unheard of, because if we were to stay within the customs about what happens with a widow, if there were no sons to produce an heir, then under the custom, the father-in-law would have taken his daughter-in-law to produce an heir. But nevertheless, Judah goes off to the city of Timnah to shear his sheep. This process of shearing sheep was often accompanied by a raucous party with lots of drinking. And so it seems very likely that in this inebriated state, when Judah sees this woman he believes to be a prostitute on his way to Timnah, he invites her over and sleeps with her. But since he didn't have any money on him at the time, he says, "I'll pay you tomorrow." But in the meantime, she says, "Okay, but until you do, leave me your signet ring, your staff, and your cord." There in verse 18, he says, he gives her these things, and he went into her. He was supposed to pay her with a goat, a young goat there in verse 17. He didn't have that on him, but he says, "All right, I'll bring you one tomorrow." And in the meantime, he leaves these things with her. This was kind of the equivalent of us leaving our driver's license or a credit card as collateral. You ever borrowed something at a store maybe that loans tools out, and you have to leave a credit card on file with them to make sure you bring it back? You don't get your card back until you bring it back. Or maybe you've had to leave your driver's license somewhere so they ensure that until you can come back, they have a way to identify you. That's exactly what happens here. Well, he goes to bring the goat to her the next day as payment. But she's gone. Nobody knows anything about her. Nobody seems to have seen her. She's just up and vanished. And Judah assumes that he's in the clear. But that's not the case either, because verse 18 tells us that she had conceived by him. Well, 3 months later, verse 24 tells us that Judah receives this word that his daughter-in-law Tamar has been immoral and has become pregnant by immorality. She had slept with someone who was not her husband. This would have been definitely seen as a form of sexual immorality. And as you can imagine, Judah is outraged by this. This is embarrassing to his family. He believes this child to be illegitimate and shameful, and he vows to burn her at the stake. This was an incredibly cruel punishment that he suggests here. In verse 24, the standard punishment for such immorality would have been stoning. But Judah goes even further than that. He wants to make sure she suffers even more for the shame that has been caused to his family, not knowing the humiliation that's coming. And as she was being brought out, as she was on her way, she sends a message to her father-in-law, Judah. And she says, "By the man to whom these belong, I am pregnant." And she said, "Please identify whose these are, the signet, the cord, and the staff." And Judah knows he's been had. Back in verse 23, he had said, "Let her keep my things, or we shall be laughed at." He knew that if it was found out he'd been in with this prostitute, it would cause embarrassment to his family. And he says, "I'm not too concerned about who knows. Just let her keep them. Let's let all this go away. This will allow me to maintain my dignity, my integrity, my reputation." But in verse 25, Tamar produces them. And Judah knows. But there's something to be said for the way Judah responds. Judah owns up to the truth. And in Genesis 38 and verse 26, he says, "She is more righteous than I, since I did not give her to my son Shelah." And he did not know her again. Judah says, no, what she did, she was more righteous. I didn't hold up my end of the bargain. I did not give to her what I should have. I did not treat her the way I should have. She is indeed more righteous than I am. Judah owns his mistakes and his sin. He owns his deception. This truly would have been a humiliating and embarrassing situation for Judah's family. But he doesn't deny it. He doesn't try to pretend that his things had been stolen and that she had gotten them somehow. He owns his mistakes, acknowledges his failure, and acknowledges the righteousness, even if a bit deceptive, of Tamar. Well, from there, the time comes when she gives birth. And it tells us in the text here that she has twins. As the twins begin to come, the first one comes out a little bit and his arm comes out, and the nursemaid who's there with her ties a scarlet cord around it to know which child was born first. But eventually something happens and the order of the children gets swapped, and Perez comes out first, but he was not the one with the scarlet cord on his wrist. The younger twin becomes the older in this process, the one to come out of his mother's womb first. And with that, chapter 38 comes to a close. But all of this story does still beg the question of why in the world we get it right here. Why does chapter 37 end with Joseph in Potiphar's house and chapter 38 not pick up with that? This seems like a weird place to interject this story of Judah and Tamar. But I believe there are a few more similarities than it may seem. Both stories, in the story of Joseph and the story of Judah and Tamar, do involve a dramatic identification of someone with a personal item. In Genesis 37, it had been Joseph in the coat of many colors, or whatever the coat may have been, as we saw last time. In chapter 39, I don't think this is a spoiler, but just in case, spoiler alert, Potiphar's wife is going to use the piece of Joseph's cloak that she has to say, he tried to sleep with me. And of course, we know that not to be the case. We'll talk more about that next week, though. The same way that here in the story of Judah, his staff and his cord and his signet are a dramatic means of identification through personal objects. We also see a similar thread through sexual temptation. In the case of Judah, he gives in to it. In the story of Joseph, he's going to flee from it. These stories also again remind us of God's preference for the younger over the older. We've seen it time and time again. We saw it in Isaac rather than Ishmael, Jacob instead of Esau, Abel instead of Cain, if we really go back to the beginning. We've seen this time and time again. We've seen it in Judah, that it will be Judah, not his older brother Reuben, who is the line of promise through Jacob. And again, we see it here, because it's going to be through Perez that the line to Jesus continues, that the line continues to David before that. The greatest of Israel's kings is going to come through a younger son. Eventually, of course, we'll see that in David too. David's not the oldest, but the youngest son. And he'll become the greatest of the kings. We again see that here. But more than anything, I think what this story and the story of Joseph both remind us of in a powerful way is that God brings about good from evil in order to preserve life. God brings about good from evil in order to preserve life. In giving and finally having an heir, the line of Judah continues. And it eventually brings us to David and to Jesus. And through Jesus, God fulfills once and for all the promise that through Abraham all the nations of the earth shall be blessed. In the case of Joseph, God saves that line by putting Joseph in Egypt in the right place at the right time. God providentially leads him to where he needs to be, even through the midst of things that his brothers meant for evil. It also seems that this story fits here because chronologically the incident with Judah and Tamar happened while Joseph was in Egypt. The whole story certainly didn't. We know that it would be near impossible in 22 years' time that Joseph was in Egypt for Judah to get married, have 3 sons, see 2 of them die, send Tamar away, waited long enough time for his youngest son, who was too young to be old enough to marry her, and not send him to do that, and then for his wife to die, and then for him to go see Tamar and them have a child together. Chronology doesn't fit there. But it does seem that the last part of this would belong there, this encounter between he and Tamar. Well, all of this also, I think, should remind us of a couple more points that we should consider as we close. And that's one of Judah's, and the first of those is Judah's faith journey. At the beginning of this story, and throughout the previous encounters we've had with Judah, it seems that the apple hasn't fallen too far from the tree. The same kind of deception that we had seen in his father at various times and in his uncle Laban and others, we have seen in the life of Judah. It seems that when our story picked up, he had just recently been involved in selling his very own brother into slavery, and only doing that after being talked out of killing him. He devises this plan to deceive Tamar and not send his youngest son to marry her. He doesn't look like a very righteous individual. But following this encounter, following the humiliation he must have faced from this, it seems that Judah grew spiritually. Because the Judah we encounter in the rest of Genesis is very different from the Judah we encounter at the beginning of chapter 37. And it seems that this is the turning point. And it all begins with his confession and acknowledgement of his own lack of righteousness, in contrast to that of Tamar. It marks a turning point in the life of Judah. And what a turning point it is. That even the way he started, through Judah, God will still bless the world. Judah's going to grow. He's going to receive a substantial blessing from his father, Jacob. His tribe will become the largest of all the tribes of Israel. And it is through Judah that we eventually come to the Lion of Judah, Jesus of Nazareth, the Savior of mankind. To put that in 2020 language, Judah got a pretty good glow up from where he started. This should remind us of the same thing. If anything, the book of Genesis has taught us over and over that life is a journey of faith. And the most important thing is not how low we get, but where we end. That we are not defined by our failures. And that even in the midst of evil and wickedness and sin, God can bring about good. I think the story of Judah and Tamar also serves as a reminder of us of the importance of caring for widows and other vulnerable populations in society. As a widow, Tamar was being mistreated. Her father-in-law was attempting to deceive her and not treat her the way society said she should be treated. Not treating her the way he had an obligation to treat her. But as a widow in ancient Near Eastern society, she was vulnerable. She was sent back to her father's house, in many ways a social outcast. She had to dress differently to indicate that she was a widow. And she was not being treated the way she should be. Scripture repeatedly reminds us in both the Old and New Testaments of the importance of caring for those types of people in our society. Even still, we have an obligation to do so. And perhaps especially now. Have you checked in on our widows in our congregation lately? Have you checked to see how they're doing? Being apart has been difficult on all of us, even those of us who have companionship at home. Imagine what it might be like to be going through all of this by yourself. To be disconnected from everybody. We still have an obligation to care for our own widows in this congregation. Are we doing that? Are we checking on them? And not just them, other vulnerable people in society. Time and time again, we're reminded that the care and concern we have for others will be reflected in the way God views us. Well, as we come to an end of a rather bizarre and strange chapter and story in Genesis 38, I think the big message still remains the same. That life is indeed a journey of faith. And that God is at work to turn evil into good if we will let Him. But what kind of journey are you on? Are you moving up or are you moving down? If we're not moving upward, then let's make some changes. And let's be the kind of people who end better than we start.